significance in world history is often overlooked. It's oftentimes treated as an outlier or an exception to the connections of world history, considered to be a standalone continent, generally, unrelated to the outside world. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. Africa was actually an incredibly important part of world history from the classical period on, connected to Europe and connected to Asia in the old world system. And then as you move into the early modern and modern periods, connected to the Americas by an elaborate system of trade routes that would allow for the exchange not just of goods, but of ideas, beliefs, traditions, diseases as well. So what we're going to do in this video is to take a look at the role played by Africa in these two world systems, beginning with a review of the old world system. So the old world system generally focused on the connections between Europe, Asia, and Africa through a system or through a series of global trading networks. There were three primary global trade networks that emerged between 500 and 1500 that made up this old world system. They were the Silk Road, the Sea Roads, and the Sand Road. And they connected Eurasia with Africa in increasingly elaborate and significant ways. So the Silk Road was a series of land routes that connected China with Eastern Europe. It went through Central Asia, through Western Asia, into Anatolia, and then into the region known as the Balkans. It would also connect with Africa through the Sinai Peninsula, and a number of luxury goods were traded between East Asia and East Europe along the Silk Road. The sea roads were a variety of sea-based or water-based trade that included trade between North Africa and Europe along the Mediterranean, that included trade between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula across the Red Sea, and between the east coast of Africa and India across the Indian Ocean. So there were a variety of ocean-based or sea-based trade routes that connected Africa with the so-called outside world. And then the Sand Road connected West Africa, which could be relatively isolated in the ancient world, in the classical and early modern worlds, because it was set apart from Eurasia by a desert. So the Sand Road, which was facilitated by the camel, allowed for Western Africa to be connected with North and East Africa, and then integrated into broader trade networks from there. So in the old world system between 500 and 1500, Africa was connected to Eurasia through these three basic trade routes. And as always, it wasn't just goods that were traded across these trade routes, but ideas, beliefs, cultures, language, disease as well. And so Africa, large parts of Africa, would be shaped by these encounters with the outside world. Africa would serve an equally important part in the New World system that began with the creation of the Atlantic world in the late 15th and 16th centuries. So let's talk a little bit about the New World system. European conquest of the so-called New World, by which they mean the Americas, North and South America, European conquest of the New World changed the nature of the global economy. For centuries, China had been the clear winner in the Afro-Asian world, in this trade between Eurasia and Africa. They were the primary beneficiary of global trade. They had the silk, they had the spices, they had the luxury items that Europe wanted. And China had little interest in Europe. Many in China believed that Europe had little, if anything, to offer Shangguo, meaning the Middle Kingdom, which the Chinese understood to be the most advanced civilization in the world. So for centuries, China engaged in a trading partnership in which they exported far more than they imported, putting the balance of economic power clearly in the hands of China. This changed in the late 15th century. This so-called age of expansion, or age of colonialism or conquest, when Europe crossed the Atlantic and conquered the Americas. First Spain and Portugal, and then other parts of Europe, established colonies in the New World after Christopher Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas in 1492. These colonies would be integrated into a new trading system, this time across the Atlantic Ocean, that would fundamentally change the history and destiny of 3 continents and also the history of Asia, the nature of global trade. This trading network is often referred to as the triangular trade or the Columbian exchange because it established an elaborate trading network that connected 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Each continent was responsible, or each territory, each area, was responsible for providing a set of resources to the trade. The New World, for example, provided raw materials and new natural resources such as sugar, tobacco, rice, new foodstuffs, all of these New World crops that would change Europe so dramatically. Europe contributed manufactured goods like guns, cloth, beads, ironwork, metalwork. And Africa provided natural resources, particularly in the form of slaves. Slaves were used in these New World plantations to produce cash crops as efficiently and cheaply as possible. So what we're going to do is to take a look at this triangular trade a little more in depth so that we can understand the way that it would transform the 3 areas that participated in it. Let's start with the Americas. The Americas, both North and South America, provided raw materials and natural resources to this global trading network, to this Atlantic world. There were dozens of new crops that were introduced from the Americas to Europe and Africa, but some of the most important included tobacco, indigo, rice, eventually cotton. But it all started with sugar. Sugar was the first major cash crop to transform the global economy in the Atlantic world. Sugar was nothing new. It had been native to Southeast Asia and had been understood as a luxury item traded along the Silk Road for centuries. Sugar originated in India about 2,500 years ago, entered into the Mediterranean, and from there into Northern Europe in the 13th century. It was exotic, it was rare, and that meant that it was expensive and luxurious. It was by no means a staple crop or even something that most people had access to. Sugar was left to the elite and for very special occasions for the middle class. Sugar was not indigenous to the New World. In fact, it made its way to the New World with Christopher Columbus during his 1492 voyage. But they discovered that sugar grew well in a tropical environment like that of the Caribbean. It grew extremely well. It grew in abundance. And abundance led to falling prices. Falling prices led to increased demand. And increased demand led to a number of entrepreneurs who wanted to capitalize on that demand. There was a lot of money to be made off of the production of sugar in the New World. And so sugar plantations began to pop up, began to be built in the Caribbean and Brazil. Sugar would soon account for a third of Europe's economy, and that sugar was being produced in the New World, primarily in the Caribbean and Brazil. Sugar was a labor-intensive crop, an incredibly labor-intensive crop, growing in harsh climates, harsh tropical climates, and requiring a tremendous amount of labor to cultivate. Europeans first tried to use the indigenous populations of the Americas, the first Native Americans, as labor. But the same factors that allowed Europe to conquer the Americas so easily, namely disease, also reduced the potential workforce of Native Americans. So there was a scarcity of labor for these sugar plantations. And in 1505, Europeans would first turn to African slavery. Slaves were imported into the New World first to work in these sugar plantations. 87% of the transatlantic slave trade went to the Caribbean, Brazil, and Guyana to work in these sugar plantations. 5% went to Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas to work in tobacco plantations. And about 8% went to Mexico, Central America, and other parts of Spanish South America. So you have this economic system in the New World that's built on slavery. So slavery was nothing new. But slavery was nothing new. Slavery had been a part of human societies pretty much since their earliest inceptions. We see evidence of slavery in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, India, and it had existed in parts of Africa for centuries. Slavery was part of the political context of West Africa, competition among city-states, power struggles, wars, rivalries. It was also influenced by economic demand, trade across the sand road. But prior to about 1500, this slave trade was very small in scale. It went eastward and was primarily associated with conspicuous consumption or display of wealth. It was also not something that could be passed down from generation to generation. So while slavery is nothing new in the 16th century, it did dramatically change scope and scale as it entered into the transatlantic slave trade. This slave trade was directly linked to economic growth, so that slavery underwrote the New World economy. It was not a sign of wealth or conspicuous consumption, but was the foundation of a cash crop economic model in the New World. Cash crop is a crop that's produced in abundance, so an area only grows one crop, but they grow it in a surplus. And then they sell that surplus, they sell that crop in order to finance the other things that they need. So you see cash crops in the New World like sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, eventually cotton. And slavery, African slavery, underwrote that economic system. The transatlantic slave trade also changed the scope and scale of the slave trade. As many as 12 million slaves were involuntarily taken from their homes in Africa and sent across the Atlantic Ocean in the Middle Passage to work in these New World plantations. And this New World slavery, this transatlantic slave trade, was based on racism in a way that earlier forms of slavery they weren't necessarily. Slavery was based, American slavery, transatlantic slavery, was based on a belief that Africans were an inferior race. They saw African slaves as less than others, in many cases as something less than human. And it created a society that was differentiated based on race. So African slavery then became the hinge on which the Atlantic world turned. And the growth of the Atlantic world would displace the Old World model. In 1520, when Ferdinand Magellan rounded the southern tip of South America and found a sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific, he allowed Europeans to once again reach China and Asia, this time from the east. But these new arrivals brought something that electrified China, and that was silver. Silver was arguably the most precious metal in China and the most important form of currency in the Ming Dynasty. All business was transacted in silver, and so when Europeans entered into the Pacific or entered into Asia from the Pacific, a brisk trade developed. Silver was mined in the Andes Mountains and delivered not to Spain or to Portugal, but to China. They exchanged it for silk, porcelain, other Chinese luxury goods. And at first, this flood of silver was an economic boon to China. But the increased supply led to a decrease in value, and the result was rampant inflation, tax deficits, bloody unrest, and ultimately the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. China was no longer the Middle Kingdom, no longer the center of global trade, because the global economy had shifted to the Atlantic, and the result was the origins or the basis of European hegemony, which was built in many ways on African slavery. Thank you.